Amazing. Good afternoon, everyone. It's very exciting to be back with you. So we are continuing on our story. We started last week. We were focusing on the story of Noach. And the role, what we were looking at Noach is really doing a close reading of the text. And we were trying to enter into the story of Noach from the eyes of the commentators. And the job of a commentator is to comment, but really you can only comment if you're noticing, if you're reading closely, if you're noticing, and if you're asking questions, just as many questions as possible. And one of the things we really narrowed in on is looking closely at the raven and the dove. And we began asking questions about the raven and dove that maybe we hadn't asked before, like why the raven and why the dove? And what's the difference between the raven and the dove? And how do we understand when the Torah says that the raven flew to and fro, and just kept flying to and fro? What was that all about? And when the dove flies and then comes back and then flies again but never comes back, what's going on with the dove? And we looked at several different commentators who noticed those same things that we noticed and offered their answers, their interpretations of what did we saw several different meanings of what was the raven doing flying to and fro, and why was the raven sent versus the dove, and why was the dove sent. We're going to be continuing to look at the story of Noach, specifically again focusing in on the raven and the dove. And today we're really going to ask the question. We're going to look at the question of what was it like to come out of the ark, and really what was it like both for Noach to come out of the ark, and what was it like for the raven and the dove to come out of the ark. And again, I mentioned this last week, I'm just feeling that this text is particularly resonant for me right now in this time. When I think about the extent to which we are all in our own arcs right now, we don't know, we went in here for maybe 40 days thinking it'd be a 1 or 2 month thing, and now it turns out it's a 6 month, 1 year long thing. We don't know when we're going to be coming out of the ark. And while we're in the ark, there's a sense in which the world we knew is changing irrevocably, and we don't know what kind of world we're going to find when we go out. And I think that there could be a lot of fear and anxiety about when to go out of the ark and what the world is going to look like and what we're going to find. And so I'm seeing a lot of parallels in the story of Noach to the moment that we're in right now. Specifically, we're going to be, whereas last week we were focusing on a close reading of the Torah and on some of the major commentators. So we were looking at commentators like Rashi from the 11th century through some of the commentators through the 15th century. We also looked at Abarbanel. He's the one who asks a lot of questions. What he does is he asks all the questions at the front, and sometimes even just his questions are invaluable. So we were looking from the 11th to 15th century. We're actually simultaneously going to jump backwards today to earlier midrash that's written around the 3rd century. And we're also going to jump forward and see some very, very modern midrash that was written just in the last 10 years. So you're going to get a taste of a very old ancient midrash paired with very modern midrash. Before we can dive in, we have to first sort of unpack what is midrash. So midrash comes from the Hebrew word lidrosh. It can mean a couple of things. We know that when Rebecca was trying to get pregnant and was struggling with infertility, the verb that the Torah uses for when she tries to communicate with God is that Rivka was doresh et Hashem, that she either inquired or sought God, or made a demand of God, but that the thing that Rivka was doing is she was doresh, she was seeking or demanding or inquiring. And so midrash shares that same root. It comes from that word lidrosh, which means to seek or to demand or to inquire. And so what is midrash? Midrash is a interpretive text in which we are doing that to the Torah, in which we are asking questions, we are seeking the Torah, we are demanding something of the Torah, we're demanding for the Torah to sort of make more sense to us. So midrash can come in when there are things in the Torah that the Torah doesn't explain, there are things in the Torah that feel confusing, there are things in the Torah that feel like they're in contradiction with themselves, things that feel hard for us to understand. And that's where the role of midrash comes in, is to offer that backstory, to offer that interpretation to help make the Torah make more sense for us. And generally, there's 2 types of midrash. Midrash can be separated into 2 categories, not always cleanly. Sometimes midrash can fall into both categories, but there's midrash agadah. Agadah, you might recognize, sort of sounds like the word Haggadah from like the Passover Haggadah. What's a Passover Haggadah? Telling stories. So what is midrash agadah? It's midrash that's about telling stories. So this is midrash about, here's an example of midrash agadah. We know that Abraham goes to sacrifice his son Isaac. What we don't know is what was Sarah doing that whole time? What was Isaac's mom, Abraham's wife, doing that whole time? And so you might have, and you do have, midrashim that sort of offer the story of, well, where was Sarah while Isaac was nearly being sacrificed? That would be an example of midrash agadah. You also have midrashim that fall into the category of midrash halacha. So halacha, like Jewish law. Midrashim that are interpretive, but they're interpreted not just for the sense of here's a backstory that you might find very interesting and there might be meaning to it, but they're actually interpreting for the sake of creating law. That new law is created based on these interpretive traditions. And so an example of that is the Jewish people, part of kashrut is that we're not supposed to eat the sort of the sinew of the leg, the gid hanasheh, the specifically sinew in the leg. It's off limits to us. And how did we get that? It comes from when Jacob was wrestling with the angel. And so there's a midrash, and he, the angel wrenches Jacob's leg. He gets hurt in this place. And we say there's a midrash halacha, a legal midrash that teaches from the fact that Jacob was wounded in this way. It teaches all future generations. This is even before the Torah was given. It teaches all future generations that that part of the sinew, the gid hanasheh, is off limits to us. So that would be an example of midrash halacha. So the midrashim that we're going to be looking today, I would say fall in the category of midrash agadah. They're midrashim that are attempting to tell a story to add meaning. And I'll just say one more word by introduction is generally when you're learning a midrash, much in the same way that we talked about with the commentators last week, you want to ask two questions. You want to ask what question is the midrash coming to answer? Meaning, why does the midrash exist at all? If the Torah was perfectly clear, the midrash wouldn't need to comment. So what is the question that the midrash feels the need to answer? And what is it adding? And the second question is, what is the linguistic thing in the text that's allowing the midrash to make that leap? Because presumably sometimes we might feel that midrashim are just like fanciful stories that the rabbis create out of nowhere. And we might have that feeling. The rabbis don't have that feeling. The rabbis feel like their midrashim are very much anchored in the text, in an extra letter, in a missing letter, in an extra word, in a missing word, whatever it is. And so it's not only what is the question the midrash is trying to answer, what is it adding, but also how is it making its midrash rooted or grounded in the text in some way. Okay, so we're going to be asking those questions. We're going to hopefully see two short midrashim in our time together and one longer one, and we'll be asking those questions of what is the question it's answering, and how is it making its claim to the text. Okay, any questions on any of that before we go ahead and get started with our midrashim today? You could go ahead and chat your questions into the chat. In the meantime, while you're doing that, I'm just going to share, I know you have the source sheet hopefully from Ari, but just in case, I'll share it again there so you can go and open it up yourself. And we'll just go ahead and we'll get started and we'll screen share. And if you come up with a question, I'll pause and go to the chat in just a little bit. So I'm going to go into a screen sharing mode. Okay, amazing. Just make this a little bit bigger for you. Okay, so really the question we are going to be looking at today is, what was the experience of coming out of the ark like? The Torah doesn't really tell us a whole lot about that. You might remember the Torah tells us briefly, we have this strange story after the ark where Noah comes out, and what happens? We find that Noah, you could see it here on that first source, we find that Noah becomes drunk. And there's this sort of unseemly incident where he becomes drunk and one of his sons uncovers him and disgraces him, and the other two sons cover him back up and say, don't do this. And it feels like you could, it's interesting enough, the commentators don't, but it feels like you could draw a connection to this and say, well, perhaps Noah is so traumatized coming out of the ark that the first thing that we see that happens after him coming out of the ark is Noah sort of disgraced and naked and drunk, as though perhaps this is in a response to coming out and seeing a world totally destroyed, that he's sort of in so much pain and trauma from it. So I think it's possible from the Torah to maybe make a connection between this story and the experience of coming out of the ark. Interestingly, the Torah doesn't make that connection explicitly, and commentators don't actually make that connection explicitly. And other than that, Noah comes out of the ark. The Torah tells us explicitly in the story we were looking at last week that all of existence is blotted off the earth The earth is unrecognizable. It's wiped clean. Everything dies. Even the commentators debate, remember, it's all water that's flooding. The commentators debate whether that also means that the fish were blotted out of existence, or did they at least get to live because they were living in the water? But whatever it is, everything is obliterated. And then the next story that we hear about in Parshat Noach is the story of the Tower of Babel. Well, all of a sudden, it's like civilization has regrouped. There's tons of people. They're all speaking the same language. They're doing this great project. They're building a tower. God scatters them all. But the point is to say that even within the span of one parsha, you go from everything is obliterated to now we have a civilization that's working together, speaking a language, building things. And so the question there is, well, how do we get from all the world is obliterated to, we've repopulated the earth? What happens in between? The Torah doesn't actually fill that in. And that's where the midrashim that we're going to look at today, I think, come in. They begin to paint the picture of, well, what came between Noach stepping off the ark and suddenly, all of Babel coming together and building a tower? What were those middle steps? So we see, again, a little bit in the book of Genesis, Noach being drunk and uncovering themselves as maybe an indicator of his experience, but again, not really clear. So let's look at our first midrash together. So our first midrash, you can see it comes from a collection called Genesis Rabbah. Genesis Rabbah is a collection of midrashim, a collection of interpretive texts specifically on the book of Genesis. And it was compiled between 300 and 500 CE. Just like there is a Genesis Rabbah, a collection of midrashim on Genesis, there's also an Exodus Rabbah, midrashim on the book of Exodus. There's a Leviticus Rabbah on the book of Leviticus, a Numbers Rabbah on the book of Numbers, and there's also a Deuteronomy Rabbah on the book of Deuteronomy. Interestingly enough, the compilation, the writing of those midrashim actually span, whereas Genesis is an early collection between 300 to 500 CE. Numbers Rabbah isn't actually compiled and written until possibly 1300 CE. So much, 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 much later. But you do have these early midrashim. There's also other collection of midrashim. The rabbahs are like really big ones. Like if you're looking to get into midrash for the first time, or often if you're hearing a midrash reference, oftentimes it will be from one of the rabbahs, the Genesis Rabbah or Exodus Rabbah. But there are several other major midrashic works, besides this collection of rabbahs. So what is Genesis Rabbah teaching us here? It's going to first quote a verse that we looked at last week from Genesis 7. Vayimach et kol hayakum v'she'er ach Noach. So God wiped out all of existence, and only Noach remains. So the word only is corresponding to the Hebrew word here, ach. And also the verse goes on to say, only Noach remained, and also the animals and the other people who were with him in the ark. But the key here is that everything is wiped out, and only Noach and those who are with him remain. That word ach. Okay, so what are we going to learn here? So Rav Huna b'shem Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav Huna says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, ach, the word ach, mi'ut. The word ach is a limiting word. It's coming to teach us something that is limiting, meaning to say, like, it could have said, the verse could have just said, Vayimach et kol hayakum, God wiped out all of existence, Vayishe'er Noach and his family. And Noach and his family and the animals, they remained in life. But the fact that the verse has that extra word ach must be coming to teach us something. That word ach is available for interpretation. It's available for a midrash. And it's teaching us something that is a miyut, that's something about minimizing the scope of something. So what are we minimizing? We're minimizing the fact that Noach survived. So what is it going to say? Ach mi'ut she'af hu haya goneach dam mipnei hatzina. Because even Noach was coughing up blood because of the cold. Okay, I'm going to say that one more time. It's a brief midrash, but I think it's adding a lot here. So it's saying from the fact that we have that extra word ach, this word that's limiting something, that's minimizing, it's something, even Noach was coughing up blood because of the cold. So I want to pause there and ask you the question, what do you think that this midrash is adding? What information is it adding that changes how we understand the story? And how is it grounding it in the text itself, in the story of the Torah? What is this midrash teaching us? Okay, good. So Maria is saying there was sickness. So either that other people were sick or that Noah himself emerged sick. Okay, good. Deborah is saying beautifully. Noah didn't come out whole. Rita says Noah didn't completely escape. Yeah, that the story that Noah didn't come out unscathed, you guys are seeing it. It's really profound and amazing. Noah had a physical emotional reaction to seeing the world after the flood. So Howard says, the Midrash is using kol hayakum, everything that was standing, to infer that Noah was not standing, therefore he must have been ill. So the must be limiting. Okay, good. Good. So Ari says the scale of the utter devastation. Good. So you guys are seeing it. I mean, it's really like, we never think about this before. I never thought about this before, that it seems like, it's such a great story for Noah, right? God says, all these bad people, I'm going to wipe them off the earth. You just go in the ark. And Noah says, fine, I'm not going to worry about anyone else. I'm going to do what I'm told. I'm going to go in the ark with my animals and my people. Flood's over. Noah comes out. World goes on. Everything is fine. And this Midrash is saying, it's saying, actually, it didn't quite go that way. Even though Noah emerged, even though his family emerged, even though the animals emerged, they were not unscathed. That even Noah, the leader of these people, he came out affected to the extent that he was coughing up blood. Right. So Maria says, what about his wife? Is she too unimportant to mention? There's a modern writer who actually wrote a whole book about, I think it might even be called Noah's wife, who felt the need to. There's not a lot of midrashim about, I don't know if there's any, I think there are some midrashim about Noah's wife, but she felt the need to create a novel that is modern midrash, specifically giving voice to Noah's wife and her story. But what you see here is that it was not such a simple story for Noah, that even in Noah's coming out, he had. Right. So Karen is saying, now you're pointing to what was it that led him to sort of be debilitated, to sort of have this coughing of blood, to be limited in this way. So Karen says, perhaps it was guilt that he didn't argue with God to save more people, his own sort of survivor's guilt. Jeffrey says the shattering of a worldview, the world that he thought he knew that was there before has been completely changed, right? And Howard is saying, and Howard, I love this, I want to make that connection explicit. I think it just feels so obvious to me that perhaps this also may explain why Noah gets drunk later. I think you could connect them. Again, I didn't see anyone making that connection, which feels so surprising. Maybe we don't want to say that about Noah. But it does feel like it could speak to, thank you for including that, Ari, that the fact that Noah comes out sort of scathed in this way, that he's coughing up blood, that it's almost as if he barely didn't make it out, then you understand why moments later, he's drunk in the tent and he's sort of disgraced in this way. He's a person that's still suffering with the aftermath. He's not just this fearless leader that walks out and everything is fine, that there's a real aftermath to trauma. Okay. Let's look at another midrash together. This is also from Genesis Rabbah, also on the notion of coming out. So it says, Devar acher always means here's another opinion, which is to say there was some other opinion came before that I'm not including, but Devar acher means I've given you one interpretation and now here's another one. So we learn in the book of Cowardice, in the book of Ecclesiastes, to everything there's a season and a time to every purpose. There was a time for Noah to enter the ark. How do we know that? Because the text says, Bo ata v'kol beitcha el hateva. The text says, come now, you and your house, come to the ark. That God says, here's the time, come to the ark. And also there was a time for Noah to leave the ark. How do we know that there was a set time for him to leave the ark? Because God said, se min hateva, go out from the ark. But Noah didn't accept the order to go out. The lo kibel alav, it said, that when God said in this command form, God said, se min hateva, go out from the ark, right? Noah had to even be, we talked about this last week, it could have been that Noah sees that the rains have stopped. He sees that the waters have gone down, and eventually Noah would go out of the ark on his own. He would realize it's time, but that he doesn't. That Noah needs to be commanded by God, leave the ark, because Noah is not ready. He's afraid, whatever those reasons are. And that there was a time when he was supposed to go out, and he doesn't. Not only does he not go out, but when God tells him to go out, he doesn't do it. The lo kibel it, he doesn't do it. Instead, Noah says, am I to go out and be fruitful and multiply for a curse? Just think to yourself, meaning what? What is Noah's complaint? And well, I want to hear your comments in the chat in just a minute. Just think for a moment. What is Noah? Why does Noah not want to go out? What is he saying back to God? Am I to go out and be fruitful and multiply for a curse? Until the Holy One swore to him that the Holy One would not bring another flood upon the world, as it says, for this is the waters of Noah to me. For as I have sworn that the waters of Noah should never more go over the earth. So quoting actually from the book of Isaiah, that it says in the book of Isaiah that God swore that the waters of Noach should never more go over the earth. It was only then that once God swears that the floods will never again, that God will never bring the floods, is Noach willing to leave the ark. So what is this midrash? What is this midrash adding? What is it giving us, this midrash? And also, how is the midrash connecting it to the language of the text? Go ahead, and I'd love to see your answers in the chat. Right, so Joanne says, it's as if Noach is saying the world was in total destruction, and are you just going to bring the flood again once I'm out there? Noach's like, where is that? You've told me to go out and be fruitful and multiply, but how am I to know that you're not going to just destroy the world again? What's the point of me going out? What's the point of me starting all over again after this total catastrophe? The work it's going to take, the investment, the hope. What's the point of me getting my hopes up of me doing all this work when there's a chance that you might actually just destroy the world again? Jeffrey says the courage to act in spite of one's fear. Failing to do this leads to cowardice. Right, so Jeffrey, it seems like you're pointing out that perhaps Noach is lacking courage. When Noach is scared to go out, he's lacking the courage. And what this midrash is teaching us is how important that we have to have courage to act, even sometimes in spite of our fear, even when we're afraid to do that. Deborah says, good, that Noach, good also, Rhea, that Noach challenges God and doesn't just simply obey. It's actually really interesting when you think about it, that when Noach, one of the things that Noach gets faulted for, or we ask questions about, that there are midrashim about, when God told Noach to build the ark, why didn't Noach challenge God and say, like Abraham, why didn't Noach say, well, don't destroy all the world, or what if there's 50 good people in the world, or what if there's 20? And Noach doesn't do that in Torah. He does just simply obey. And so it is actually interesting to have a midrash in which the rabbis are writing in that Noach challenges God, that says, really, but is there a point to all this? Can you promise me that you're not going to do this again? And it's only when Noach pushes God in this midrash that God promises. Oh, good. So that's exactly what Rhea was saying. Noach does not totally trust God. Before in building the ark, he does not question, which actually maybe is exactly the point, right? That initially Noach followed faithfully, that Noach didn't question. And then when Noach sees what happens when he follows without question, he learns that actually sometimes you do need to challenge authority. That if you just follow without question, people get wiped out. And perhaps he regrets having not questioned it initially. And so now after the fact, he's actually challenging God. That's very interesting. Maria says he's still arguing with the Holy One. Arnold said this could imply that Noach doesn't have faith, contrasting with Abraham. Yeah, I think that you can read that into here. And I think it's also understandable why Noach might not have faith in this moment, why he would be scared. So Joanne said, is it a selfish concern as compared he followed God's command when it only affected others? Joanne, that's interesting. So that's a different way of understanding it. In the beginning, when Noach doesn't argue with God, it's because he's not being affected. He gets to go into the ark. He's going to be safe, his family. And here, when it's actually his own life is on the line in terms of going out into this world, he might also be affected. Then he begins to argue, or then he's afraid. That's an interesting point. Yeah, and I think the question of, well, how does it, so I think what this text is adding, I think it's adding a couple of things in terms of what is the question it's addressing. I think it's addressing a couple of questions. One, I think it's addressing, why did the Torah specifically need to use the language of tzeh min hativa? Why did God have to command in command form? Why did God have to command Noach to leave the ark? It must mean because Noach had a certain resistance or hesitation that he wasn't doing it on his own. And I think it also, this midrash, I think also addresses all the stop and starts that we saw last week. The flood starts, he still doesn't go out. If the waters go down, he still doesn't go out. He sends a bird, he still doesn't go out. He waits another 7 days, he doesn't go out. He waits another 7 days, he doesn't go out. That hesitancy, I think now this Genesis Rabbi is sort of giving us a little backstory of perhaps Noach was so afraid. Perhaps he was lacking in faith. Perhaps he didn't want to face that world. And that is connected to that language of God commanding him, no, no, no. You have to go out now. Now is the time. Okay. I appreciate all of your thoughts on this. You can see already with these two short midrashim from Genesis Rabbah, I feel it deeply enriches our picture of what it might have been like for Noach to leave. In the Torah itself, it says, God said leaves, he's drunk, Tower of Babel, we move on in the story. And what the midrashim are doing is they're creating a pause they're creating a little bit more of a space for us to be in the world of the story a little bit longer, and to feel what would it have been like? What would it have been like for us? What can we take away from that? And again, I think that you can then start applying these midrashim to our own lives of what is it like when we're in recovery from trauma? What is it like when we're coming out of the ark? What might it be like for us if this is what it was like for Noah? Yeah, so Joanna's saying if he had gone out earlier, he would only drown. So he wasn't wrong to leave at that time. Joanne, that's true. But I think that there was actually a period of time where there was some language in last week where he waited another 7 days to send out the dove, when it seemed like perhaps the waters had already gone down and he was waiting like an additional cautious 7 days. I think that there is sort of additional caution that's built in there, which again, might be totally fair and very smart considering what had just happened. But it's certainly not like, the flood stopped and I'm out of here, that there is a sense of not knowing when is it going to be safe to go out and being careful. And again, Joanna's saying rightfully so. Okay, now we're going to jump. So these midrashim were written 3rd, 4th century, 300 to 500 CE. Now we're going to jump forward to a collection of modern midrashim that were written just in the last decade. There's a wonderful book called Dir Shuni. It comes from actually a Rashi. Rashi will sometimes say, if Rashi finds a verse particularly confounding or interesting, he will say, in his interpretation, he will say, it's as if this verse says, Dir Shuni, interpret me, seek me, demand something of me. And so the book is named after that comment from Rashi where he says a verse is saying Dir Shuni. Dir Shuni was compiled by a woman named Tamar Biala, who, an Israeli woman who lives in Boston right now. She teaches actually in part at Hebrew College, the rabbinical school where I was ordained. And she compiled modern midrashim written by Israeli women. So these midrashim fall under the category, the idea is it's a collection of modern midrashim written by Israeli women that are feminist midrash. And I think you could ask a question there, what is feminist midrash? And there are lots of different answers. A couple of answers. One answer of what feminist midrash might be is it's offering midrashim from the perspective of it could be midrashim about any topic in the Torah. It could be about revelation. It could be about child rearing. It could be whatever. But it's offering midrashim specifically from a woman's perspective. And it's feminist just by default, just by dint of the fact that a woman is writing it, thinking of the fact that all of the midrashic tradition that we have until today is written by a specific gender, so that it's just feminist. It doesn't matter what topic it's talking about, the fact that a woman wrote it, it's giving us a different lens of interpretation that we haven't had before. It could be feminist midrashim because it's specifically focusing on the women's experience that's normally not highlighted in the Torah. So there actually are midrashim in this collection of Dir Shuni that, for example, highlight Sarah's experience during the binding of Isaac. The Torah doesn't seem to have any interest in where was Sarah and what was going on with her. And so the feminist lens there wants to zoom in on that and say, well, what was that like? And I think it could also be feminist midrash just because it's bringing some sort of alternative perspective, not even that it's focusing specifically on women's issues or a female character, but that what it's trying to do, its goal is to lift up unheard voices, women or otherwise, but to lift up and sort of honor alternative voices that we might not normally see in classic midrash. So the midrash that we're going to be looking at is actually written by Tamar Biala. She's the editor of the book, but there's a number of other women who contribute to the book. So it just happens that she wrote this one. And the midrash is called The Raven and the Dove. So we're just going to go ahead and start reading it, and we'll pause throughout. It's a little bit of a longer midrash. So this is how it begins. Nishala lehem bebeit midrash shalofot hashemayim. A question was asked in the Beit Midrash. So a question was asked in the house of learning of the birds of the sky. Already that this midrash is offering you a different perspective. She's playing with language that it's actually really traditional language. There's a lot of traditional midrashim that start with the language of a question was asked in the Beit Midrash, but here the question is not asked in any old Beit Midrash. What is the Beit Midrash in which a question is asked? The Beit Midrash of the birds of the sky. She imagines that there's a Beit Midrash in the heavens where the birds are learning together. And she begins to sort of play out, well, what would birds notice? What would birds comment on, right? And this goes back to this being feminist midrash in the same way that perhaps sometimes a woman reading a text or a woman offering a midrash might notice things that someone who is not a woman might not notice, that the birds in the Beit Midrash of the heavens, they might notice things in the text that other people might not be focused on. So what do you think the birds are going to notice? they're going to ask about the dove and the raven, because the birds, we as human beings are like, okay, there's the dove and the raven, but really we're focused on Noah, and we're focused on Noah's wife and his family. Maybe the animals, we don't usually spend so much time thinking about the dove and the ravens, but obviously the birds of the heavens, they're like, well, what happened to that dove and the raven? We care about that perspective, and so now we need a midrash to speak to that. A question was asked in the Beit Midrash of the birds of the sky. The raven and the dove which Noah sent out from the window, whatever became of them? After all, of the raven it was written, Vayishalach et ha'ore vayetze yatso v'shov ad yevosh ha'tamayim me'al ha'aretz. So it says about the raven, this is now quoting in classic midrash form, it's quoting verses from our story. It says about the raven, it went off and it went to and fro, yatso v'shov, it went back and forth until the waters were dried up from upon the earth. We never really hear, the raven doesn't come back in the story, it just goes to and fro, and eventually that's all we hear from it. But it doesn't say what became of him. And as for the dove, it is written, Vatashov elav ela teva ki mayim al pnei kol haaretz. And it's written that she came back to the ark because there was water covering all the surface. Ubatar kativ, and afterwards it's written, Belo yasfa shuve lav od, and that dove didn't come back to him again. So remember, the story of the dove is that she goes out the first time, there was still water, so she comes back. And Noah takes her in the hand and brings her back in. He waits another 7 days, sends her out again, and this time she doesn't come back. But the Torah doesn't say where she went or what became of her. Okay, so now we have to wonder, what happened to the dove and the raven? They sent the high-flying eagle who can bear another bird on his wings to fetch them. Beautiful. So they're trying to figure out, the birds of the Beit Midrash are like, well, let's go send a delegate. Let's go send someone to find them. So who do they send? They send the high-flying eagle. Why do they send the eagle? They send a bird that is big enough to carry another bird on its wings. That, God forbid, should they need help, should they be injured, should they need emotional support, they send a bird that can carry the weight of them. And the eagle flew away for a day and another, and then returned with the dove and her entire family. Since from the moment she found a home up until that very day, she had been birthing and caretaking, breeding a multitude of sons and daughters, but he did not return with the raven. So I just want to pause here and add, I want to hear your thoughts specifically, so you can already start typing these in the chat, of how you understand the actions of the dove. The dove goes out one time, she comes back, there's too much water, goes out again, we don't hear from her again, and now we find out, what has the dove been doing since the day that she made a home, since the day she left the ark? She's been birthing and caretaking, breeding a multitude of sons and daughters. Okay, so I want to ask you how you understand her response. If we're reading these stories as responses to trauma, how do you understand her response? While you're typing your responses to the chat, I just want to add for you, there's a frame on, I learned this midrash from my colleague at Hadar, Rabbi Avi Strausberg. And she says, I think she learned it directly from Tamar Biala, who wrote the midrash, says the frame on how to read this midrash is actually as thinking about the Holocaust and different responses to coming out of the Holocaust, of all the multitudes that were killed in the Holocaust, and the different way that different people handled that grief and handled that loss. And so that this is one way, this is sort of like one person that might have emerged from the Holocaust. If the person who found a home and until this day has been birthing and caretaking, breeding a multitude of sons and daughters, sort of in this mode of recovering. Okay, so now I want to look at the chat to hear your thoughts. So Beverly says she's been being a dove. Okay, she's doing the work of being a dove and creating other doves and caretaking. Joanne says, dove knows her job, which is procreation, and brings forth more life, as she would have before the flood. Edward says, where does she find a mate? That's a good question. I mean, there were the two that were on the ark, so perhaps there's like the other dove eventually comes off and joins her, but that's a good question. Audrey says, the fact that she presumably has been birthing and caretaking shows that she has hope for the future. It's beautiful, Audrey. And perhaps that was the hope that Noah himself didn't have initially, that he was afraid to go out, that God had to assure him it would be okay. Muriel says, the dove is doing the traditional work of a woman and is following the commandment to procreate. Howard says, the female response to the total destruction of everything would be an intense drive to help the world repopulate and recover. Ari says, this is how the dove addressed the trauma, rebuilding her family and her species. Right, exactly. This is just one response to trauma. One response to trauma is rebuilding the family and her species. Marianne, the dove, she created a new home and a future. Okay, beautiful. So let's see what happened to the raven. They asked him, that raven, couldn't you find him? So this is the eagle. So the eagle comes back to the Beit Midrash and they say, okay, you found the dove, but what happened to the raven? And they say, the raven, you couldn't find him. And he said, I found him flying here and there. There's that language, sort of the to and fro that we saw in the Torah, that he was flying to and fro, to and fro. So the eagle says, I found him flying here and there at the ends of the earth, and he refused to come with me. He said, ever since the day that Noach sent me out, I haven't stood or rested. And if I didn't return to him, how can I return to you? I answered the eagle, Noach has long since died, and neither his children nor their children's children are still on the earth, and nobody is still waiting for you. Such a hard reality. There's a sense in which what the eagle understands is that the raven is he's waiting to be called back, or he's waiting for something this whole time. And so the eagle says to him, you're sort of like, you're living in a past that doesn't exist anymore. Noach has died, the children have died, the children's children, what are you waiting for? Nobody is waiting for you. You can finally stop flying. You've been on this mission, but you don't need to be in this frantic going back anymore. That story is over now. You can move forward. He said, died and passed from the earth, and I didn't know it. His head drooped earthward. There's this moment where the raven realizes that he's been in this past, that actually none of those people exist anymore. They've all died, but he's been stuck in this moment. There's a sense in which he hasn't stopped moving even in this conversation, but now there's a pause. He stops for a moment. Once he raised it, he concluded, I won't join all of you and won't stop flying until the Shekhinah, until God, the Shekhinah is the feminine name for God, until the Shekhinah tells me to, for the earth is defiled. And of the Shekhinah, it is written that she dwells among the impure with their defilement. So this is referencing another text. There's other texts in the Gemara that says, where does the Shekhinah, where does God's presence dwell? That God actually dwells amongst those who are impure, that God dwells amongst those who have been defiled. A really profound statement that God is not only with the pure, but God is with the impure, that God is with us in our sadness. And so he says there's a moment where it seems like maybe the raven considers that perhaps he should stop flying if Noach isn't still there, if that story isn't being told anymore. And then he said, no, I still can't stop. I still can't come back until like God's self calls me back and tells me to stop flying. This earth is defiled and I will keep flying. As long as the earth is defiled and this is where the God's presence is to be found, I will keep flying. So the birds have to decide what to do. They voted and they decided to go and find the Shekhinah, the God, and bring her, the raven, so that he may cease from his flight. The birds of the sky asked the luminaries, where is the place of the Shekhinah? And they didn't answer. They asked the beasts of the field and the fish of the sea, and they didn't answer. They're looking for God everywhere, and they don't know where to find God. They asked the trees and the grasses, and even they did not know. At that time, when they were looking to one another and seeking answers from one another, they heard the Shekhinah calling to them. And she says, Hineni, po, I'm here, b'neichem, between you. She'atem yoshvim ve'oskim b'talmud Torah ve'ani makshiva v'gadlayim echem. Because you are learning and you are immersed in Torah, and I'm listening and I'm growing with you. So it's such a powerful teaching. That's also, I think, a very rabbinic teaching, is that we go to all these places, all these efforts looking to find God. Where is God? Where is God? We can't find God. And where is God? God's actually God's with us. God's amongst us. The fact that the birds are both doing this, they're occupied with Torah, but really what are the birds doing? They're occupied with the Torah of helping the raven, of figuring out what to do with their friend. The Shekhinah says, you didn't need to go looking for me. I've actually been here with you. She revealed herself to them in the image of a very large stork. What do you make of that? Remember, this is the story where we're getting to see the birds, all these different birds. We have the raven and the dove and the birds of the heavens. We have the eagle that could carry, right? Why send the eagle? Because the eagle could carry, in theory, the raven and the dove on its wings. And now we have the Shekhinah, God's presence, appearing as a stork. Anyone have any ideas? Okay, good. So Marian says rebirth. Even just sort of in the classic image of like, where do babies come from? The stork brings them. So that the Shekhinah, God's presence, is being symbolized by the stork, who is the symbol of birth and of new life. Okay. So the eagle went and brought the raven, who was well on in his years, his wings dry and gray, limping in flight. The dwellers of the Beit Midrash said to him, "Why do you fly back and forth with no rest?" I'll just read this to you in the Hebrew. So there's a couple of resonances there. One, that line of, what is it that you're flying yatso v'sho, back and forth? That's actually quoting from our Torah portion, that it says the raven went out and she flew back and forth. The velo motze manoach, who doesn't find rest? It's none other than Cain. That when Cain, after Cain kills his brother, that's the curse, that Cain will go out, that the blood of his brother calls out, and that Cain is cursed to be a wanderer, to go back and forth and to not find any rest. And so we see here that it's like the raven is living this cursed existence where the raven is just going back and forth, but is unable to find any rest. So they say, why do you do this? Why are you doing this to yourself? He said, where should I stand? Where should I rest my wings? This is where I think you really hear the Holocaust. Anywhere I try to stand, anywhere I try to stand, the dead eyes of my brothers and sisters are staring at me. And anywhere I try to sit, the earth stirs and groans. And the weeping voice of my brother's blood rises up from it. Again, that line in the Hebrew, the kol damei achi, the voice of my brother's blood, that language is also referencing Cain and Abel, the story of Abel's blood calling up. It's like the raven says, what do you want from me? Where would you have me stand? Where would you have me sit? This world that you've sent me back into is a world where, like, I just see the images of the dead all the time. I see all my dead brothers and sisters, all those, and who are the brothers and sisters here? It's the birds. Again, we only think about the people, but it's the birds. It's like all of those other ravens that he lost. Anywhere he tries to sit, the earth groans. The earth, even in the story in the Torah itself, that the earth itself has been defiled, and that the weeping voice of my brother comes up from it. They answer. Let me just pause there. This is a lot to take in. I just want to turn to the chat and say, let's pause here and say, I see Howard's posted something, so I want to read that in just a minute. How are you understanding? We've seen two different responses now. We saw the dove who went out, and from the moment she is out, she's been creating a home and birthing and creating multitudes. And we see the raven who is unable to stop moving, is stuck in that moment of to and fro, who sees those brothers and sisters everywhere. How do you understand this response of the raven? How do you understand these two different responses? So Howard says, the raven has a response of despair. It can't face the immense task of taking responsibility for rebuilding the world, so it waits for God to do it. Yeah. Quite reasonably. Edward said the raven has survivor's guilt. Karen said the raven needs therapy. Yeah, the raven needs help, for sure. Ari says, I like the selection of the stork as the shechina, the chasidah, right? The word for good, Ari, thank you for pointing that out. So the word for stork in Hebrew is chasidah, which is connected to the Hebrew word for chesed, or kindness, indicating thus the character of the bird, which is noted for its affection for caring for its young. So good, so we both have sort of like our modern parable of who brings the babies, that's the stork, but also that the word in Hebrew is chasidah, is rooted in the word for kindness, that it's the one who is the embodiment of kindness, that ultimately is the Shekhinah, as God, but is going to be the one to be able to bring back the raven. So Cynthia says, the dove is the optimist who's seeing the hope, and the raven is the pessimist. And Jeffrey says the raven has lost hope. Yeah. And you could see all the different, the different responses, both if we read this as sort of a story of the Holocaust, or if we read this as a story about any trauma. I think what I would take from this is not that the dove is doing something good and the raven has done something bad, but that these are both really normal responses to trauma, that there could be the person who, has hope and goes on birthing and creates multitudes. And there also could be the person that's unable to move forward. And those are just sort of natural responses to trauma in this way. So they say to the raven says, what would you have me do? Where would you have me stand? How could I possibly stop? And they answer, but the dove found land on which grass grows and took an olive branch in its mouth and then went and blossomed and sought out a new life. And she's still giving birth even now, right? The dove could do it. The dove was able to see the dove's way forward. Why can't you be like the dove? And it is written, the waters left firm ground upon the earth. And the earth is waiting for you and those like you for thousands of years to come back. They're saying, come back. The dove could do it and you could do it too. I mean, really, this is coming from a place of caring, that the birds of the Beit Midrash are worried for the raven. And they're saying, we just want you to stop. We want you to come back. And the raven says, he answered them, even if the waters have left firm ground upon the earth, I cannot dwell on it. This is quoting the Hebrew. Shenemar charvu pnei adama, the face of the earth has been destroyed. Umakom she'en lo panim, ein yucholim limchot dim'ah mimenu v'lasir mimenu charpa'ah. He says, the face of the earth has been destroyed, and for a place that has no face, its tears cannot be wiped away or its disgrace. There's a sense in which it's saying that the earth has been so destroyed, it's so numbed, it's so obliterated that it's like the tears that are being shed can't even be wiped away because there's no face. There's a sense in which he's saying, you know, you're saying there's firm ground, you're seeing the firm ground, I'm seeing an earth totally destroyed, that it's like the tears can't even be wiped away. Okay, just a little bit more. At that moment, the sun began to set, and the sky seemed to them as red as blood. The inhabitants of the Beit Midrash looked at the dove, and they saw that she was tired and weeping. Ayafa ubocha. And they looked at the raven, and they saw that he was losing his mind. How do you understand that part? The sun began to set, and the sky seemed to them red as blood. And they look at the dove, and what is the dove doing? She's tired and weeping. And what is the raven doing? He's losing his mind. How do you understand that? I'll just read on the last paragraph, and then you'll bring your comments in to sort of think about. We saw the dove doing one thing, but what is this new picture of the dove? They looked to the Shekhinah, the dove and the raven. They looked to the Shekhinah, and they saw that she was spreading her wings, and they were large, and a warming wind arose from them. And the Shekhinah arose from her place and went over to the dove and raven and sheltered them with her wings. The raven ceased his flight. The dove's soul was rested. So in the Hebrew, it's there, Amad Orev Mimo'afo, that finally the dove ceased flying. Nacha Nafsha Shel Hayona. So in the Hebrew there, it's her soul rested. This expression that Tamar is using is all over the Gemara. Nacha Nafsha is like euphemistic, nice language for the dove died. That the soul finally finds rest when the soul dies. And so in these final moments, they look at the Shekhinah, they see the warm embrace, they both come to them, the Shekhinah shelters them. That's when the raven is finally able to stop flying, and the dove dies in that moment. The dove's soul finds rest. And some say that at the moment one could hear the murmuring of the Shekhinah, who was saying to the birds who dwelled in the Beit Midrash, Ma lanu etzel yonah ve'orev. What do we know about the dove and the raven? Shelo orev anu ve'lo yonah anu. What do we know about the dove and the raven? Because we are not the raven, and we are not the dove. And they did not send us from the window to see. How do you understand that? How do you understand that last part about the dove and the raven? And how do you understand that last line that God, the Shekhinah, seems to be saying? So Rita says, maybe the dove realized that the raven was right, that maybe at that final moment where the dove is weeping and tired, that the dove realizes that the raven is right. Okay. Joanne says, dove could release her sadness and therefore keep her sanity and go on. The raven didn't allow any release, and therefore he could only live in his mind continually in the destruction. Okay, so Joanne is sort of speaking to the ability to release sadness and move on versus being stuck in that. Howard says, the dove saw that no matter how many children she raised, she could not even begin to restore an infinite destruction. And the raven was farther along in the process of being consumed by despair and already lost his mind. And only God can give us understanding of our own mortality in the end. Rochelle says, even radical empathy has its limits. Rochelle, I'd love to hear more about what you mean by that. I like the idea of that. For me, one of the things that I see there with the dove that the dove being tired and weeping. As we look at the dove, we might have looked at the dove, the birds of the Beit Midrash do, right? They say to the raven, the dove is fine. The dove has been building things. The dove has been procreating. The dove found dry land. What are you doing? Just come back. Just stop doing it. And yet it turns out that all along, the dove is weeping and the dove is tired. That the dove is doing those actions. And yet those actions are just as much a process of grieving as what the raven was doing. That the dove has been deeply grieving all along, just in a different way. It manifested in a different way than the raven. At the end of the day, they are both still broken and tired. They just sort of had different manifestations, different ways of exhibiting resilience. But it's not that the dove, sort of like Noah, it's not that the dove emerged unscathed. It's that the dove went on, but that still in there was that sadness. Rhea says, the story of Noah has become in some places a childlike story. We have toys that are carved animals and the ark. Yeah. These midrashim understand the tragedy that's happening to the earth. God is not destroying the world, we are. Yeah, that's really beautiful. I mean, I literally, after I taught the class last week, it happened that we were reading our kids a bedtime story, and the book that my 2-year-old grabbed off the shelf was like a very kids version of Noah, in which like the animals go on the ark and they have a slumber party and it rains and then they come back. But you're right that there's the child story version of Noah is such a neutralized story, and these midrashim help us sort of understand the tragedy of it and sort of the human element, the bird element, the way in which trauma sort of lives on and affects, and that it's not so easy to recover and to rebuild. We have to rebuild. We have to go on. That's really important. But that it's not like flicking a switch, that there's a process of that, and that resilience can look really differently for different people. And so both Beverly and Aletta, they say in that closing line of the Shekhinah is so beautiful. What do we know about the dove and the raven? We're not the dove, we're not the raven, is to say, we can't judge how people respond to tragedy. Even the birds of the Beit Midrash who are acting with compassion and love for the raven, is that they can't bear to see the raven in pain. Ultimately, there's a sense in which they're judging the raven and saying, you are not responding, well, you're not like sort of bouncing back quick enough. And that the Shekhinah, God self is saying, Muriel is saying this too, perhaps we can't understand one's pain unless you have walked in the shoes, that we can't actually judge how people respond to tragedy, that everyone has their own response and they're all, in a sense, equally valid. Okay, you all have such beautiful comments here. Karen says, the dove carried all that weight for the rest of her life and was exhausted. But she had just been all that time when she was birthing and creating those multitudes and pushing forward and maintaining the hope, that having that hope and rebuilding can just be exhausting. Rochelle says, so this is on the radical empathy, has its limits. So the eagle, as sent out by the Beit Midrash of the birds, are sent out to understand what happened to them. Survival has a price, always, and radical empathy doesn't fully understand the trauma. So even to the extent that they really, even when we are our most empathetic selves, when we really are trying to open ourselves and understand, at the end of the day, there are limits to our ability to understand someone else's trauma. Good, and that's part of what the Shekhinah is teaching us. Okay. Good. Okay, so I'm gonna stop screen sharing here so that I can get to see your faces. So just to say again, that beautiful, I think, that beautiful Midrash is written by Tamar Biala, modern writer and scholar. You can find it in the book Dear Shuni, which you actually can order on Amazon. And I just really want to, I love teaching that Midrash because I just think it is such a powerful teaching on opening up the story, on helping us think through different responses to trauma, helping us think through the way that resilience can look differently for different people, helping us think through that even in this moment that we are in which on one hand, it's like we're all in this thing together, that we're all being impacted so differently, and that we can't judge any one person's response to it, that we're all going to be responding to the moment that we're in differently. And so I just really want to give credit to Tamar Biala for constructing, I think, such a beautiful midrash that whoever would have thought to focus on the dove and the raven, only the birds of the sky would have thought to highlight that. And for me, going back to what are we doing here, this class that's focused on Midrash, what is Midrash doing? I think part of what Midrash is doing is it's pushing us to take a pause. It's pushing us to ask a question and to create more space in the story to sort of raise up What are the voices that we haven't heard? What are the perspectives we haven't seen? What else might we understand if we allow this story to open a little bit more? So I really want to thank you for joining in today. I'm looking forward to continue learning with you for the next few weeks. We're moving on to the Jewish legal text. We're going to be looking at the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch. And if all those things are new words to you, it's okay, because we're going to do them together. But we'll be leaving Noach behind to move on to some other text.
Thank you. Just one last point. I was looking up Dear Shuni to see if I could, what I'm going to share after this program, and notice it was in Hebrew. So I don't know, has it been translated to English yet? Because it wasn't.
Yes, great question. I think it's still, she has been in the process, thank you for reminding me of that. She's been in the process of translating it for years. And I think it's like always on the verge of coming out in English, and perhaps it's not quite out yet in English, but hopefully soon. And honestly, if she does release it in English, I will make sure to email you so that you know about it.
I did note, by the way, there's a Dear Shuni Part 2 that was just published.
There is, I know, and I want them both translated into English immediately.
Okay, so if you're fluent in Hebrew, you can buy, well, either, if you're fluent in Hebrew, Dear Shuni Part 1 and Part 2 are available. Yeah. And maybe you can translate it for the rest of us. That would be helpful. Yeah. Okay, I will share stuff after this program that I found about Tamar, Dear Shuni, and Midrash Rabbah, and Noah's wife and stuff like that. So thank you, everybody, for participating in this class, second class. We go to class 3 next week. Very touching. What a great contemporary midrash, something I probably would never have come across if not for this class. Thank you, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the learning, and we'll see you soon. Have a great Tuesday. That's right. Bye, Howard. And Sippy, good to see you. Chris Tex here, I can see you. And Mary Brockett said hi. The Cornells are somewhere there, and I see Mike and Sybil, as usual, sitting on the couch. David Silverman seems very comfortable over there. Good to see you. Bye, guys. Have a great day. Keep learning.